It was the summer of 1989 when the hikers went missing in the Great Smoky Mountains along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. A young couple from Ohio headed off to explore the backcountry trails around Cades Cove, only never to be seen or heard from again. At first, it was chalked up to inexperience and lack of preparation for the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Southern Appalachians. Rangers launched an extensive search after their car was discovered abandoned in the parking lot at the trailhead, but not so much as a backpack or scrap of clothing could be found amid the vast swaths of rhododendron hell and primeval forest. Over the next few years, the cluster of missing persons cases continued to mount. Always solo hikers or couples wandering off the designated trails and into the remote gorges and hollows where Park Service personnel rarely patrolled. Around a dozen missing in total, a yearly cadence far exceeding normal statistical odds. Something wasn't right. By the mid-90s, rumors began to spread through the gateway towns ringing the Smokies about what could be happening on the untracked side of the misty, jungle-like mountains. Strange folk tales told by old-timers around crackling fires soon worked their way into the fears of even the most rational park rangers and Forest Service employees. For this part of the Appalachians harbored dark pockets of isolation from society. Entire clans and families, known as holler dwellers or brush apes by the civilized locals, had made their untamed home in the most remote, lightless valleys and caverns for generations upon generations. Places unreachable by even the most sure-footed hikers and containing God knew what in terms of feral descendants eking out a Stone Age existence. These almost mythical tales spoke of families committing centuries of inbreeding and souls drifting far beyond the constraints of the modern era or enlightened thought. The bloody stories passed down recalled unspeakable acts of cannibalism, demonic rituals, and the worship of strange deities and cursed haunted objects that no sane man should behold. The old mountain men and shamans insisted that even the very word holler was an ancient Cherokee malediction, the mere utterance of which could draw the ire of the brutal inbred hordes that prowled between the densest ridges and creek beds, sending on interlopers without mercy or reason. Of course, such talk was always whispered out of earshot of tourists and flatlanders. Heaven forbid they get wind of the area's dark, Lovecraftian underbelly and spook away the lucrative flow of dollars trickling down the parkway hotels and shops. But for those that grew up in those hamlets and boggy settlements, the lore was a palpable cloud hovering over the Great Smokies, like foul wood smoke smoldering above a moonshine still's dying embers. Only the most remote and brawniest of the park rangers paid any credence to such backwoods superstitions, as the missing persons file stacked higher with each passing year. Not until the summer of 2001 had enough empirical evidence emerged to lend genuine credibility to the macabre legends. That's when a militant environmental activist, Amanda Willis, strayed off the Appalachian Trail on a personal sabbatical to, quote, reconnect with the spirit of the forest womb, end quote, as her blog described it. Miss Willis was an experienced survivalist in tune with the perils and rhythms of the great outdoors. So when she failed to exit the mountains at her predetermined endpoint and rendezvous with her ride, immediate alarms were raised about that this was no ordinary vanishing act or a case of an amateur nature lover going lamentably unprepared into the wild. Her gear was military grade, essentially a roving base camp's worth of supplies and communications equipment that allowed her to upload trail photos and microblogs from the field as she went. Until her last transmission, coming northwest from the upper headwaters of the Cherhola River in one of the least charted sectors of the Smokies, accompanying the post was an image of what seemed at first to be an elk or bear carcass fouling the riverbank ahead. But when authorities were able to make out the fine details within that final photo through grisly magnification and contrast enhancement, they deduced Willis may have stumbled onto the remains of a human skeleton. one that appeared to have been crushed and gnawed upon, with shards of bone splintered into the black rocky soil, as if discarded by some rending creature far larger and more powerful than should exist in nature. That's when the big guns got called in. Search and rescue emergency response teams from county, state, even federal law enforcement divisions were called into the Smokies to mobilize a manhunt for Willis on an unprecedented scale that hadn't been seen since Dennis Martin's disappearance back in 1969. Coming at the case from the assumption the activist had unwittingly become the prey of a highly organized hunting party, squad after squad of armed men began airlifting into the deepest, most inaccessible hollows and ravines the rangers adamantly warned them to avoid, where these holler beings were said to dwell. What resulted over the next 2 sweltering summer months, grid searches through the briared, ivy-choked, smoky wilderness, was nothing short of a waking nightmare to even the most hardened agents rotated in fresh from departmental SWAT operations in Chicago and New York City. But they began finding the unburied remains of the previous missing person cases in layered, grisly chunks, with stark evidence that they'd been dragged from the forest beds and consumed voraciously in a sort of depraved, macabre feast. Flesh picked clean from shattered bone, the scattered remnants of which had been tossed away in the same nonchalant manner a sloven diner might actually brush crumbs of bread from his beard. To the seasoned eyes of the deployed forensic examiners and cadaver dogs, there was zero doubt that these meticulously reassembled skeletons belonged to the same vanished hikers who haunted the missing persons cold case files. Any lingering hope of a grisly attack or savage murder by sociopathic loners was swiftly dashed at the obvious signs of ritualistic desecration of the remains. The deepening horrors only worsened as first contact was finally made with the members of the ultra-reclusive Holler clan suspected to be behind the attacks and ritualistic abominations. As recovery squads penetrated further into the vine-throttled vertical basins and canyons, they described putting rounds into what could only be categorized as subhuman mutants living in nests of debris and clumped together in shrieking, camouflaged masses. Reports described the hostiles as nude, with gnarled bodies covered in animal pelts and fungal lesions, seemingly the byproduct of centuries upon centuries of isolated inbreeding taken to its logical, macabre extreme. These creatures appeared to have entirely devolved from any recognizably human standard, hunched and knuckle-dragging, with gnashing pits of razored teeth and milky, roomy eyes for the sizes of saucers that betrayed zero comprehension at the sight of their organized, mechanized brethren opening fire on them from helicopter gunships hovering above. Though these initial contacts inflicted undeniable casualties on the mutant hill tribes, forcing them to disperse under withering fire deeper into the root systems of the hills, all involved officers reported a sinking horror. That for every monstrosity put down, untold dozens seemed to remain burrowed into the bark-woven, fetid hive nest, clinging to the primordial boulders in places no geologist had ever mapped or surveyor charted. Conversely, the palpability of these long pig sacrifices the clans were making had only grown more ritualized and ornate the longer their reign of terror had continued on. The true depths of their bestial appetites laid bare in the form of meticulously arranged Golgotha-type bone pits containing the remains of all genders and ages, as if to obscenely celebrate each successful hunt. Any misguided notions of prosecuting a criminal matter against clearly sentient perpetrators of these murders was abandoned in the furnace of stomach-churning reality. What the teams had uncovered was that this necropolis of ancient amoral cultures hadn't been mankind's descendants, but its inbred, cannibalizing forebears. For while law and order, church and state, the sciences, and beacon of enlightened philosophy had long since extended their web to most pockets of civilization, that same steady march of human progress and ethics had clearly left these untamed pockets of wildest Appalachia utterly untouched beyond the black coat of prehistoric savagery. To these depraved hunter-gatherers clinging to the mossy precipices and mists of the Smokies, the wealthy urban hikers and nature lovers ambling through their hunting grounds were seen simply as prey, succulent and unsuspecting meat sacks ready to be honored on the red altars of their depraved deities and feasted upon in diets stretching back to prehistory. With the situation escalating to biblical proportions and all attempts to communicate or negotiate with these omnipresent holler tribes falling on deafened animalian ears, the decision was quickly made to extract all operational teams and enact a scorched earth evacuation plan. Under presidential emergency statutes, a 100 square mile swath of the Great Smokies interior was forcibly evacuated and restricted as a temporary no man's land, bisected by the Cherhola Ridge line and plunging all the way down to the Appalachian Trail. Entire vacation hamlets were shuttered, their businesses and rental cabins seized by eminent domain, as air superiority assets turned the sector into a militarized hot zone. For the first time since the Civil War, pillars of mustard gas and phosphorus rained down on the thicketed Appalachian hills in an attempt to defoliate and drive these holler clans into retreat. As the summer haze hung wet and toxic over the baking ridgelines, helicopter gunships raked the deforested vales and escarpments with steady machine gun fire in a scorched earth offensive that left nothing alive nor any hint of the holler tribe's presence, human or otherwise. But for those who stared down into the impenetrable darkness below that poisoned vapor and muzzle flare, the question remained: had this been the final reckoning with an isolated pocket of humanity's most unholy regression, or merely a reset, allowing the holler inbreds to slip back into the plunging prehistoric depths to which they were spawned eons before and continue their depraved ways undetected for generations more? As they retreated and corkscrewed barbed wire sealed off the Great Smokies' interior operations zone, as it came to be known, bootprints left in the gray ash spoke to bare, misshapen feet, having roved across the same ashen soil not long before. Strange drums echoed out from places within the woods even artillery hadn't reached, accompanied by the eerie, discordant wails of something profoundly ancient stirring among the last lightless hollows. For this wasn't over yet. Now, deep in the ancient hollows of the Southern Appalachians, where the mist hangs thick among the mountain laurel and the creeks gurgle with voices from the unseen world, there's a legend that has curdled the blood of mountain folk for generations. It's the tale of the Bone Eater, a creature born of darkness, summoned by the blackest of witchcraft to roam these haunted hills and hollers on an endless hunt. A hunt not for flesh and blood, but for the very bones that give a body form. Old folks tell the Bone Eater being human once, but turned inside out by an insatiable greed that manifested as a ravenous hunger for the skeletal remains of man and beast alike. The more bones it consumed, growing grotesquely malformed with each swallow, the more unstoppable and depraved its cravings became. Some say the Bone Eater's origins trace back to the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, when the Cherokee Nation was driven west by President Jackson's soldiers through 1,000 miles of winter wilderness. As the tribe's huddled, starving masses passed through these very mountains, it was whispered that a shaman had made a deal with the unspeakable forces that dwell in the hollows to keep what little remained of his people alive. The price for this pact was allowing an ancient bone-eater demon to roam the lands once more, a primordial creature whose existence dated back to the Paleolithic darkness before the first ember of human civilization cast its warm glow. In this telling, The shaman had no choice but to accept the deal and unleash the horror, lest his tribe be consigned to extinction. Others claimed the Bone Eater was the twisted creation of settlers who followed Daniel Boone's trail through the Cumberland Gap in the 1770s, that the folk magic and occult lore of Scots-Irish immigrants from the Old World intermingled with Native American shamanic practices to spawn an abomination that fed on the bones of both the fragile new settlements as well as any Indian villages unlucky enough to be in its path. Whichever grim origin rings true, all agree. Once someone or something is marked as the Bone Eater's prey, their bones shall be slowly removed, one by agonizing one. The creature itself is a gaunt, hunched figure with mottled gray flesh pulled taut over its own contorted, mismatched skeleton. Its face is blank, apart from a tongue that lolls out from a mouth lined with rows of teeth made from the bones of its countless victims. To gaze upon its visage is to go insane from the sheer cosmic wrongness of its very being. But those few who have caught only glimpses of it describe a horror that moves with purpose on limbs easily as long as a grown man is tall. They tell, too, of its stench, an overpowering reek of bleach and decay that clings to its wake. More than one unfortunate soul has followed a trail of this scent into the tangled woods, only to stumble upon piles of clean-licked bones and tarnished belt buckles, shoe buckles, and the like, all that's left of past prey. The Bone Eater has dwelt in these hills, glades, and abandoned mines since before the memory of man, and it shall continue to do so until the end of days, as it seeks to slake its abhorrent thirst. Only a few have ever survived direct encounters with the Bone Eater. Josiah McCormick, a grizzled former hunter and trapper from Wolf Creek Holler, was one such man. Near 90 years old at the time, he recounted his run-in with the fiend to anyone who would listen over sips of his hourly ration of morning whiskey. It happened in the summer of 1961, when McCormick was a hale young man seeking to put food on his family's table by any means necessary. He trekked miles from his isolated cabin into the deep hollows, stalking the blackest of timbered game trails, where he found himself surrounded by what he first thought were stumps and fallen logs. Except, as his eyes slowly focused through the dusky shadows of that holler, he realized the still forms were anything but tree limbs. It was picked clean bones, a line scattered every which way. McCormick recalled in his thick southern forged burr, bones as white as corpsewood bloomers, all gnawed up and spit out like a littered boneyard spread across God's green earth. But the worst part was, I knowed they was human, and there ain't no way for a body to be left. Before the old hunter could turn tail and flee that charnel ground, he heard the crack of a twig from the tree line, then another. What emerged from the brush next has been seared into Josiah McCormick's brain for over 6 decades. This thing come a-shambling towards me, body like a gnarled root, arms and legs too long and bent at weird angles, clad in rags and fur. But what struck me worst was its face, blank, except for a lolling tongue and teeth made out of more of them polished bones, all set in rows. That's when I knowed what it was, knowed it in my soul. This was a Bone Eater. The curse of these hills brought to unholy life, coming for me to be its next pickings. Only the quick reflexes and aim of a lifelong hunter saved McCormick that evening. As the Bone Eater bore down on him, he managed to raise his shotgun and put double-aught buckshot straight into the abomination's chest at point-blank range. The shredded creature howled and fell back into the brush, beaten off for the time being, but certainly not slain. That's when I run like the devil himself was snapping at my heels, he adds with a shake of his grizzled head. Run, and I ain't never looked back. I, more'n any man, got a right to ask for it to make it out that holler with my hide still stretched tight over my bones. Now, to this day, McCormick swears on the graves of his loved ones that he can still smell that sickly reek of bleach and decay on the night winds coming off the ridge near his cabin. The scent of the bone eater, lying in wait for its next chance to feed. He knows it's still out there, too, biding its time in whatever gulch or holler provides its lair until the hunger pains strike once more. When that awful stench hits his nostrils, strong enough to taste its foulness, McCormick shutters his windows and bolts his doors. With trembling hands, he'll reach for that trusty old shotgun that he keeps loaded and laid across the table, just in case. Ready and waiting to be the bone eater's final meal if the need arises again as it did those many decades ago. For legends are born from truth buried in these pagan hills, and the curse of the bone eater has haunted the Appalachian void since its creation. Stay safe out there in these old hills and hollers. I'll never forget that bone-chilling night deep in the North Carolina backwoods. How could I, when it was the first time I came face to face with them, the feral abominations, the product of generations of inbreeding and forsaken seclusion that roamed those timeless hollows. Myself and two buddies, I'll call them Jake and Adam, had decided to go camping off-trail in the Nantahala National Forest for a long weekend of getting away from it all. Maybe get in a couple of day hikes, do some smoking, just a nice reprieve from our humdrum jobs and shitty apartment. We drove out from Asheville on Friday afternoon, blasting tunes and buzzing off the first beer run of the trip. After a couple of hours navigating washboard fire rows, we finally reached what looked like the perfect little primitive campsite. A flat clearing surrounded by big old-growth rhododendron and dense pines. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came after we'd pitched the tents and got a nice little fire going as the late spring sunset drained from the sky. That's when we started hearing noises cutting through the evening stillness. Not your typical animal calls, but strange yowls and inhuman shrieks echoing off the slopes and ridges all around us. "Yo, did you guys hear that?" Jake cocked his head, listening intently as another disturbing cry pierced the night. We all strained our eyes, searching the wall of swaying pine shadows circling our camp with slowly mounting unease. "Sounds like some messed up coyotes or something," Adam chuckled uneasily as another chorus of high-pitched wails reverberated off the hills. "Wouldn't want to run across the pack of them, whatever made those noises." We all chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the building tension. But deep down, we all knew that whatever feral creatures were lurking out there, it wasn't coyotes, or any other known predator found in these backwoods. Wisps of fog began drifting between the tree trunks as the night wore on, dampening our conversation and merrymaking as we huddled closer around the crackling fire pit. With each mournful, almost human-like cry ringing out, our casual camping trip was descending deeper into palpable dread and paranoia. The first bone-chilling incident happened around 11 p.m. when Jake got up to head off into the shadowy woods to drain his bladder. Now, we'd consumed more brewskis than we'd care to admit around the fire, so nobody thought anything of it when he started stumbling away from the light's feeble glow. That is, until we heard the unmistakable snap of a branch being stepped on, followed by a shocked yelp and a sickening thud in the darkness. My heart leapt into my throat as Adam and I froze in place, listening to the awful grunts and rustling of a struggling unfolding in the night mere yards away. "Jake, you all right, man?" Adam croaked, fear cracking his voice as we gripped the closest bottles and logs we could find for defense. Just then, our friend's hysterical screams cut through the night, underpinned by nauseating visceral rending of flesh and tearing wet snarls that sent chills down both our spines. Whatever had Jake in its clutches was a far cry from any coyote or even a bear attack we'd ever imagined. But without a second of hesitation, Adam and I plunged into the ink-black forest with adrenaline surging and our makeshift clubs at the ready. What we stumbled upon in that next glade of shifting mist and gnarled shadows was like a scene from the most depraved horror movie. Jake's blood-drenched torso convulsing in a listless heap on the leaf-strewn floor, while a nearby creature hunched over his remains, gleefully tearing flesh and innards away with its filthy, bare hands. As our flashlight beams converged on the beast, its hairless, stretched face snapped around with unmistakable human features, although twisted and contorted into a leering gape. Rows of jagged, feral teeth were exposed in a perpetual grimace as it hissed and recoiled against the bright light in a way that no mere animal ever would. I wish my mind's eye hadn't been seared with the image of what Jake had become in those final moments. His face frozen in a mask of horror, eyes bulging and mouth stretched wide in a silent, eternal scream of anguish as his insides were torn out and slurped into the slobbering maw of that creature. Adam and I beat a hasty retreat back towards camp, with the thing's unearthly howls undulating all around us and the faint sound of pursuit closing in behind. In the distance, more shrill cries answered the mournful call, like a pack being rallied for the hunt. All notions of salvaging our campsite flew out the window the second that evil presence burst through the underbrush, all sallow, distended flesh and sinewy, emaciated limbs. Its tongue lolled in a slack pant, strings of gore and viscera dripping from the corners of its lipless maw, as it bounded forward on all fours at impossible speed. Adam swung his branch like a bat right at its gnarled, sloping skull with bone-crunching impact, enough force that would have dropped a grizzly bear on the spot. The creature barely flinched, its eyeless sockets boring into us with primal hunger. Finally, regaining our senses, we turned and ran full tilt up the only path leading out of those gnarled backwoods. I can still hear the pack of them descending behind us, all clicking teeth and lashing tongues, hungry for the hunt as their demented howls echoed endlessly off the haunted peaks and ridges. We scaled deadfall logs and ripped through thorny undergrowth, heedless of the ripping branches and slicing rocks blooding our bare skin as we fled in sheer animal terror, survival instincts fully hijacking any reason or rational thought. At one point, in a stroke of pure dumb luck, I glanced back and saw one of those abominations backlit by a gap in the pine canopy, its shriveled body cresting a ridge far behind us as it unleashed another keening wail, so loud and piercing that for a split second I thought I would lose consciousness or just die of shock right there. That otherworldly sound was less a vocalization than it was some kind of perfect resonance that felt like it was penetrating and enveloping my body rather than my ears experiencing it. Almost as if it had been precisely calibrated across several organic sine waves to strike at multiple frequencies simultaneously, like an airborne pathogen custom engineered to spread pure existential dread straight into my soul. Is that even remotely possible? Could these Appalachian backwoods aberrations, whatever the nature of their hybridized evolution is, have some dominion over the outer boundaries of audible terror? Needless to say, Adam and I ignored every holler and wail fired in our wake from then on, clamping our hands over our ears and powering towards my old Toyota beater with singular purpose, till the heavy underbrush, gnarled roots and thorns gave way to gravel. Just shy of collapsing onto the Forest Service road at the trailhead, I glanced back one final time at that eerie curtain of fog obscuring the dammed wood's edge, just a sliver of rising moon overhead. At first, I thought maybe my adrenaline had addled my senses and they were just playing tricks on me. But then Adam gasped in shock at something behind me. Dozens of those horrid silhouettes dotted the tree line, unblinking yellow eyes peering hatefully through the mist, with arms splayed in a posture of primitive hunger, demented, hairless, pallid shapes, more monster than anything human. Whatever dimension of hell or fever dream birthed those things, it doesn't exist within our science, laws of nature, or even comprehension. On the long drive back to Asheville, we barely spoke a word. Nothing but the thrum of the engine and the crickets and our own ragged breaths cutting the night stillness. Try tracking down eyewitness reports, verified information, even obscure occult texts about these feral wild people lurking within the rugged hill country and secluded pockets of the Southern Appalachians, and you'll come up depressingly empty-handed. Too many missing person cases in those backwoods never solved or explained. Too many whispered rumors of old Native American legends seated in utter, blood-curdling reality. Too many dark chapters of our nation's history rewritten to comply with the denial of polite society. They're out there, all right, lying in wait, whether we want to acknowledge their ungodly, twisted existence or not. A perverse melding of raw, primal nature and the degenerate side of human ancestry, left to fester and mutate in those lightless, uncharted hollows for hundreds of years. Whatever Adam and I were hunted by that night felt malformed and deranged on a level modern biology or anthropology can scarcely comprehend. As if concentrated evil distilled into the most tangible flesh and blood form could somehow disobey the strictures of physics, evolution, and conventional biology as we humans understand it. All I know is that I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have escaped from those haunted hollows, largely intact, relatively speaking. Every morning, I wake up and praise whatever higher power, karmic lottery, or astronomical chance had allowed me to outrun the consummate apex predator evolution that's constantly being birthed behind our backs with each new eon. But you better believe that each time I revisit those shattered memories of stumbling upon the remnants of poor Jake's evisceration, I rue the fact that Adam and I never stayed to burn the entire cursed forest down to the root systems, perhaps salting the very earth until nothing could arise anew from that ancient curse upon mankind. Maybe then, even for a fleeting instant, the grievous sins and horrors spawned in the furthest, darkest recesses of our world would have been tempered, even if only temporarily. Perhaps even territories across the southern wilderness could have been spared once more from whatever nameless affliction continues spawning those ravenous creatures from hell among Appalachia's seemingly endless interior spaces. We can pretend to be as civilized as we wish on the surface of our society, but deep down, every person has the sinking suspicion that pure, irrepressible evil, sired directly from nature's most abhorrent womb, still lurks just over the hills, just across the next ridgeline, mocking us. Waiting in patient silence, with teeth bared and maws slavering from centuries upon centuries of purgatorial neglect, primed to devour the next trespassers, daring enough to defile their primordial dominion, that tainted, forgotten territory where mankind's rightful progressive displacements will forever fail to tame what spawned us in the first place. They are out there. Beware.